The Circassians are an indigenous people and nation native to the historical country and region of Circassia in the North Caucasus. They are one of the oldest cultures in the world, tracing their ancestry to the ancient tribes that inhabited the region, and are one of the last remaining peoples whose origin belonged to an ancient epoch or cycle of time known in Hindu cosmology as the Dwapara Yuga, otherwise known as the Great Silver Age by the Greeks and Western esotericists, and corresponds roughly to about 5000 BC. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Russian Empire began actively seeking to expand its territories to the south, and thus it aimed to incorporate the lands of the indigenous Circassians into its domain, leading to the Russo-Circassian War. After many years of tenacious Circassian resistance to Russian expansion and hostilities, the Russians resorted to genocide and expulsion of the Circassian mountaineers, which took place between 1763 and 1864, and came to be known as the Circassian Genocide. The Circassian Genocide was the Russian Empire's systematic mass murder, ethnic cleansing, and expulsion of 97% of the Circassian population, or around 1.5 million people, during the Russo-Circassian War. As a consequence of the Circassian Genocide, most Circassians were either killed or exiled from their homeland in Circassia to modern-day Turkey and the rest of the Middle East, where the majority of them are concentrated today. During the Russo-Circassian War and Genocide, the Russian Empire employed a genocidal strategy of massacring Circassian civilians who were killed en masse, and Circassian villages would be located and burnt, systemically starved, or their entire population massacred. Beginning in 1808, a Russian commission decided that in order to end Circassian resistance against the Russian Empire's expansion, the Circassians would need to be completely eliminated from their homeland. Terror as an official strategy would be enacted. Although terror methods were already in use, they were only officialized after 1810. Russian generals began to destroy Circassian villages and towns and slaughter the people as official given duty to shock the population into surrender. Entire villages would be surrounded and shot at by artillery weapons, killing everyone within them. The complete destruction of villages with everything within them became a standard action by the Russian army and Cossack units. Nevertheless, the Circassian resistance and defense of their homeland continued. In 1833, a colonel named Grigory Zas was appointed commander of Russian forces in the Caucasus. Colonel Zas received wide authority to act as he saw fit. He was a racist who considered Circassians to be inferior. The only way to deal with the Circassians, in his opinion, was to scare them away just like wild animals. Zas advocated ruthless military methods predicated on this notion, including burning people alive, cutting off heads, burning populated villages to the ground, and spreading epidemics of disease on purpose, as well as the mass rape of children by his soldiers. William Palgrave, a British diplomat who witnessed the events of the Circassian Genocide, writes, "Their only crime was not being Russian." In 1857, Dmitry Milutin, who was the Russian Minister of War, published the idea of mass expulsions of Circassian natives. Milutin argued that the goal was not to simply move them so that their land could be settled by productive farmers and ethnic Russians, but rather that eliminating the Circassians was to be an end in itself, to cleanse the land of hostile elements. Russian Tsar Alexander II endorsed the plan, and from the early 1860s, expulsions began occurring in the Caucasus. Sentiments for expulsion existed amongst prominent Russian politicians, such as Prince Kochubey. Kochubey said to Americans visiting the region that, quote, "These Circassians are just like your American Indians, as untamable and uncivilized, and owing to their natural energy of character, extermination only would keep them quiet." As Russian armies advanced deep into Circassian territory in the late 1850s and early 1860s, Circassians were evicted from their lands so that they could be settled by ethnic Russians loyal to the Russian Empire. Although the order given by Tsar Alexander II was to deport the Circassians rather than to massacre them, the Russian commanders instead preferred the idea of massacring large portions of the Circassian population. By the fall of 1863, Russian operations had become methodical, following a formula by which entire villages, farms, huts, cattle, and any food found was to be burnt in addition to killing any Circassian they were to come across. In 1864, a final battle took place between Circassian resistance fighters and the Russian army, in a battle which would be famously known as the Circassian Last Stand in Kabad. A Circassian army of 20,000 villagers engaged the Russian army of 100,000 troops in battle. The Circassian men were joined by the women and children of the villages, who disposed of their jewelry into the river and took up arms into a fight to the end. Russian troops with heavy artillery and modern weaponry killed all the men, women, and children in a scene that a Circassian chronicler who had witnessed the events described as a sea of blood. The last Circassian resistance, along with the coastal Abkhaz tribes, were defeated and then killed en masse to the last man, woman, and child, after which, on May 21st, Russian Prince Mikhail Nikolayevich gathered the troops in a clearing in the area for a Thanksgiving service and celebration. After this, the Russian army completed the final phases of expelling Circassian villagers out of their homeland and into the territories of the former Ottoman Empire, where the Circassian diaspora reside in modern times. The situation of the Circassian masses that had been driven into the coastal ports for expulsion was dire. An unknown number of deportees perished during the process, and the operation was not conducted with any degree of sympathy by the Russians. Only a portion of those who had left the Circassian coast actually made it to the Ottoman ports alive. Of the portion that made it to the Ottoman shores, many more would die there soon after. One British eyewitness recalled that, quote, dense masses of ragged men, women, and children literally covered the seashore. All looked wan and hungry. Many were all but naked. Several lay dying. End quote. The population in Circassia before the genocide was estimated at 1.6 million, with only 71,000 remaining after the genocide. The Shapsuk tribe, which had numbered some 300,000, was reduced to just 3,000 people. Overall calculations, including those taking into account the Russian government's own archival figures, as well as the Ottoman figures, have estimated a loss of 95% of the Circassian nation in the process. One of the biggest population changes came in the Circassian capital city of Sochi, which previously had a population of around 100,000 and, according to the Russian sources, was reduced to only 98 people after the events. Sources state that as many as 1 to 1.5 million Circassians were forced to flee in total, but only half made it out alive. Ottoman archives show nearly 1 million migrants entering their land from the Caucasus by 1879, with nearly half of them dying on the shores as a result of diseases. If Ottoman archives are correct, it would make the Circassian Genocide the biggest of the 19th century.